Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 575 through 578, which, of course, these don't cover manga chapters because they are fillers. So these 4 episodes cover a short arc called Z's Ambition, which serves as a tie-in to the movie that was released around this time, One Piece Film Z. Although these episodes barely factor into the movie's plot, to be honest, so it's not really required viewing for the movie either. And since I have very little interest in discussing too much about filler episodes, this is going to be a relatively shorter episode. Alright, so synopsis. This filler arc follows the Straw Hats as they come into contact with a stowaway giant that possesses the ability to shrink via the devil fruit Mini Mini no Mi, who is trying to rescue her father Pansfry from the Marines under the command of Vice Admiral Momonga, all the while also contending with a few of Z's crew, specifically Shuzo, who is trying to capture Pansfry to gain favor of his captain Z to take second in command away from Ain. So first off, to set the stage for this filler arc, let's talk about the Neo Marines and Z a little bit, as we see both Ain and Bins in the very first scene, who are essentially the 2 right-hand people of Z. The Neo Marines are an unofficial offshoot of the Marines led by a former Marine Admiral Z, who became disillusioned with the way the current Marines and the world government were handling the great age of pirates and decided to split off and take matters into his own hands. And they believe that Marines are too soft on pirates and that they shouldn't be imprisoned and instead killed on sight. Now that we have that out of the way, let's get into the episodes. Like in the past, I'm not really going to go too much into a deep dive into these filler episodes because, well, they're mostly boring and not at all that enjoyable to watch. This is definitely on the more neutral part of the spectrum. It's not absolutely terrible by any means, but it's also not all that interesting either. It's billed as a tie-in and a lead-in to the movie, but it really doesn't do much at all to set up the movie other than a few throwaway lines about how Z used to be a Marine that even folks like Momonga knew and were trained by, and you'll later find out in the movie that he used to train many of the current Marines that we all know. The main character of this story, Lily Enstomach, which is a very on-the-nose name, has the Mini Mini no Mi, which apparently is the second time this non-canon fruit has been introduced. It was originally seen in the PS2 game, One Piece Round the Land, which is like a 3D adventure game, or side-scrolling adventure game, apparently. I've never played it, but apparently that's a thing. But one thing about this fruit is that she mentions how she would go inside her enemies and then become huge, which exactly, how we all envisioned prior to Avengers Endgame. A lot of people jokingly talked about how Ant-Man should do this to Thanos, like go up his ass and just go into Giant Man. And when you really think about it, though, this would be an insanely gruesome way to kill somebody, especially if they're not someone of Thanos' caliber who can kind of withstand something like that. But now we're getting into the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Marvel Comics. But yeah, I thought this was really interesting. Also, the Mini Mini no Mi, I wonder if a human ate that, like a regular-sized human and not a giant, they would only be able to shrink. They wouldn't actually be able to get big. But since, Lily is already a giant, she can actually get big, get really small, and even become like a normal human size, which I guess would be kind of useful for a giant. I do like that when Lily and Robin explain what Pansfry is all about, how he steals food from the world government, Marines, and pirates to feed the starving, that Luffy's immediate thought is he's a hero, which matches precisely Luffy's philosophy on heroes as stated in the arc prior in Fishman Island, where he states that heroes are people who share their meat. And since Pansfry is someone who, steals food and then shares it to people, I think that's why Luffy thinks he's a hero. And Luffy hearing about a guy that goes around sharing food with needy people, of course, he'd immediately jump to that conclusion, which is pretty funny. Now, character design-wise, Nami's design is really interesting. I must say, Nami looks amazing in this little filler arc. I think it's the change in hairstyle. She has her hair actually pulled back, which is something we don't see very often, with these long bangs framing either side of her face. And so it shows more of her face, and I like how you really get a clear view of, her forehead and her entire face. And it's pretty refreshing to see like a actual significant change to her look. Now, story-wise, this whole story seems really weird. I don't even understand why Shuzo capturing Pansfry would make it so he can gain favor with Z. It's never really explained. It also doesn't help that this character doesn't make an actual appearance in the movie either, but he does have the distinction of being the first, albeit non-canon Marine, who is of the long arm tribe. And I also like his alpaca pet that he has. First of all, alpacas are cute and funny, but also its name is really funny and clever too. Alpacachino is amazing. Again, fits really well with the food theming of this sort of mini story arc. However, its concept is pretty much a ripoff of Lasso, the rifle dachshund that Mr. Four had as a pet who shot explosive baseballs. Instead of, the alpaca is a bazooka that ate some unknown alpaca fruit. And this wouldn't be the last direct ripoff of the Arabasta saga, because later on when Luffy fights Shuzo, there's a moment where he stabs Luffy with the Shigan 5 attack. And the scene is meant to evoke almost the exact same feeling and imagery of when Crocodile stabs Luffy, complete with the bright red background and the black silhouette that we saw in their first go around in the desert. There's also a minor reference to Skypiea with the thrust upstream being a smaller version of the knock upstream. It's even following the same naming convention, so there you have that. One cool thing about this filler is we really get to see many of the Soldier Dock system vehicles used at the same time. In fact, we see all three of the sea-based ones used, with the two missing ones only being the land-based ones, the Brachio tank and the Kurosai bike. And also another thing I really liked about this is the idea of the world government taking food from the people in order to feed these lavish meals for the Celestial Dragons is actually a real plot point that will come into play much later in the story. So at least the main conflict of this arc does have some relevance and basis in the overall story. So I do like that. Of course, this won't become apparent to us until far later on in the story. Another thing that they carry over and get mostly right is Vice Admiral Momonga's characterization. He's definitely a hard ass and strict, but he follows a very specific and somewhat straightforward code of justice that doesn't fall into the evil side, but he's also not quite the good side either. He's always been one of those most neutral, high-profile Marine officers, which I actually appreciate having some of those. I feel like there aren't enough like him. They're all pretty much on either side. They're either really evil or they're actually good. The only other Marine that falls somewhat in that same bucket is probably Hina, although I could easily see her being slightly more on the good side considering her close relationship to Smoker, who is clearly on the good side. Maybe Sengoku might also be more on the neutral side as well, but I feel like he is probably a little bit more on the good side as well. A running joke that I do love in this filler arc is that no one recognizes Sanji due to his absurd wanted poster and him getting pissed off about it every time. It happens only about 2 or 3 times throughout this little 4-episode arc, but every time it happens, I think it's just the way Hiroki Hirata performs Sanji getting pissed off is what really gets me. Now, one of the biggest problems with fillers is always power scaling. Now, normally I don't really care about power scaling, but it's just absurd when it comes to the fillers because it just seems like the Straw Hats are constantly nerfed to the point of ridiculousness. Based on how powerful Shuzo seems, he just seems like someone Luffy should beat in one hit with Gomu Gomu no Red Hawk, particularly after what we've seen him do to a Pacifista as well as a roided out Hody just the arc prior. And so I understand with the filler arcs, you can't have the Straw Hats engaged in too heavy of combat or anything that would drastically change them. So they have to keep it very low stakes, but just having to constantly see Luffy struggle against people like Shuzo is just a little annoying, which is another reason why I don't really like fillers because it's inconsistent. And I mean, inconsistent to the point where it's so bad that it takes you out of the story. I don't mind smaller inconsistencies, with power scaling. That's just Oda using that mechanism as a storytelling method. So sometimes he'll have characters do extraordinary things that maybe they shouldn't be able to do, or some characters seem stronger than others when clearly they are stronger. But for the most part, Oda does a good job of either explaining that away or it's not so overt that it takes you out of the story. But the filler has a really hard time with this balance because they have so few sort of avenues to explore the story. Now, speaking of powers, Shuzo, being a former Marine, has seemingly mastered some or all of the Rokushiki techniques, as we see him use Tekkai, Shigan, Geppo, and Soru. I think the only ones we don't see him use is Kamiye, which I guess he could be using to dodge things. And then we also don't really see him use Dankyaku at all. Although, additionally, I think this is the first time we've seen someone use Rokushiki in tandem with Haki, and it makes you wonder if Tekkai and armament are kind of redundant, or do they actually enhance each other? This filler seems to indicate that it enhances, but in the canon series, I feel like we never see this used, and everyone pretty much defaults to armament, and Tekkai has pretty much become obsolete in the New World, at least from my memory. And this fight is so dumb because it makes Luffy seem so weak. He's struggling against enemies that seem like he should easily beat. And the way this fight is ultimately concluded is kind of funny though. Lily gets accidentally sent flying into Luffy's mouth and she ends up gigantifying Luffy. But his clothes don't grow enough, but it's still not enough to make them rip apart, but it's still crazy that they're capable of growing enough to keep him covered, making him look like he's wearing a halter top and like booty shorts, which is a funny image. Also, if you stop to think about this from Lily's perspective, how is she comfortable or able to breathe in this state? Like, when you really think about it, she's essentially wearing a Luffy body skin, like as a skin tight suit that covers her entire body along with all of his organs. And also, like, when he does Gear Second, how is she able to withstand that heat that he generates? And I know these questions are they're not meant to be taken seriously, but with something this ridiculous, you can't help but think about them as you see this stuff on screen. Now, the last scene of this 4-episode filler arc basically leads right into the events of Film Z, and these last 2 minutes of these episodes are really the only relevant portions to the movie, because they do tease essentially the very opening of the movie where Z attacks the Marine base to get I think what they're called, the Dyna Stones or the Dyna something. And so, yeah, that they're literally on their way to start the Film Z movie. Which is interesting because chronologically, Film Z could actually take place. You could actually have that adventure take place during this time, and then when the movie ends, you could then return to the start of the next arc, Punk Hazard. Although even though Film Z was overseen by Oda and the story notes were provided by him, as well as the character designs, this movie is still considered non-canon, so don't worry about having to watch it. I do think Film Z is actually a pretty good movie, though. It was enjoyable, and it actually gives us a lot of canon type of reveals, which is interesting because it is the first movie in the post-time skip era, and so you do see a lot of characters first. You see a lot of characters that you haven't seen yet in the main series. You'll see their new designs, or things that have happened to certain characters, and really kind of fill you in on some of the little gaps, particularly with a lot of the Marine characters. So I think Film Z is definitely an interesting watch for sure. But yes, thankfully this filler arc comes to an end because, good lord, this one was so boring and dumb. Barely anything happens, and it's more akin to a Saturday morning cartoon with a villain of the week type of feel to it, and it has no stakes or substance behind it at all. But the good thing it has going for it is that it's short. It doesn't even really do much to add to the movie, but it's supposed to be setting up, which is unfortunate. But I mean, if they did that a little bit more, I think it might have been worth it. But yeah, it doesn't really do much. Anyways, thankfully, next podcast, we will be getting back to the canon material where we will finally get to begin the Punk Hazard arc, as well as the start of the massive Dressrosa saga. I decided to skip reviewing Film Z, like I mentioned in the last episode, because having to sit through these 4 episodes kind of made me lose interest in it, to be honest. I want to get back to talking about the good stuff. And I've wanted to revisit Punk Hazard for a while, because while it's not the best arc or anything, there are definitely a lot of fun things introduced in it. And so I'm very much looking forward to talking about Punk Hazard, as it's personally one of my, I wouldn't say top favorites, but it's one that I really do enjoy, despite, I don't know, I feel like the community for the most part doesn't like Punk Hazard as much, or are less favorable to it. They may not dislike it or anything, but it's certainly further down on their list. But yeah, if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment, and if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram and Twitter account at SunnyGoPodcast for updates of when I post new episodes, to see some pictures of my manga collection. Also, I've started collecting a little bit of the One Piece trading card game too, so maybe I'll start posting some pictures of my favorite cards and some favorite characters that I've somehow randomly gotten. But as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to the podcast. Stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye!